I never told my son about my monthly $40,000 salary. He always saw me living simply. He invited me to dinner with his wife's parents. I wanted to see how they would treat a poor person, so I pretended to be a ruined and naive mother. But as soon as I walked through the door, it was exactly 7:14 p.m. on a drizzly Tuesday in November when I stood on the porch of my son's new colonial-style house in the suburbs, wearing a faded polyester coat I had purchased from a thrift store specifically for this occasion for $8.50. The rain was seeping through the thin soles of my shoes, which were scuffed intentionally with sandpaper to simulate years of wear, and my hands were trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from a cocktail of adrenaline and a deep, sinking sorrow that sat in my stomach like a stone. I had parked my 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class 3 blocks away in a dimly lit cul-de-sac and walked the rest of the way, ensuring that no one would see the vehicle that represented my actual life, the life of a woman who generated a monthly net income of $42,000 as the founder and CEO of a specialized medical logistics firm. My son, David, knew none of this. To him, and especially to his wife, Isabella, and her pretentious parents, the Sterling Vances, I was Eleanor, the struggling widow living on a meager pension, barely keeping the heat on, a woman to be pitied, or more often, ignored. I rang the doorbell, a heavy brass fixture that looked polished to within an inch of its life, and waited. Through the frosted glass, I could see the distorted shapes of movement inside, the warm glow of a chandelier that likely cost more than the annual budget of the library, where I pretended to volunteer. I checked my reflection in the darkened window pane. I looked tired, small, and defeated, exactly as I intended. This was a test, a necessary, painful calibration of reality. David had called me 2 days prior, his voice tight and rehearsed, inviting me to dinner to meet Isabella's parents for the first time since the wedding 3 years ago. The invitation had felt wrong, heavy with an unspoken agenda, and my instincts, sharpened by 35 years of navigating cutthroat boardroom negotiations and high-stakes supply chain contracts, told me that this was not a social call. This was a setup. But as soon as I walked through the door, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Isabella opened it, her eyes immediately flicking down to my shoes, and then up to my coat, with a microscopic sneer that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a performative, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Eleanor, you made it," she said, her voice pitching up an octave in that fake, sugary tone people use when speaking to children or the mentally infirm. "We were worried you might get lost, or, have car trouble with that old thing you drive." I stepped inside, wiping my wet feet on the mat, acutely aware that I was soiling the perfection of her foyer. "I'm sorry," I murmured, keeping my head low, playing the part. The bus was late, and the walk was a bit longer than I remembered. A lie. I had walked precisely 12 minutes from my luxury sedan. Isabella sighed, a sharp exhalation through her nose, and turned to the living room. "Well, come in. Don't just stand there dripping. Mother and father are dying to meet you," she said, though the tone suggested they were dreading it. I followed her into the living room, a space curated to look like a page out of a high-end architectural digest, filled with cream-colored furniture that screamed, "Look, but don't touch." David was standing by the fireplace, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He looked tense, his shoulders hunched, and when he saw me, a flicker of shame crossed his face before he masked it with a stiff nod. "Hi, Mom," he said, not moving to hug me. "Thanks for coming." Seated on the plush velvet sofa were the Sterling Vances. Robert Sterling Vance was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair and a suit that cost at least $3,000, likely Italian wool, while his wife, Catherine, was draped in a silk shawl, her fingers heavy with diamonds that caught the light aggressively. They didn't stand up. They simply stared at me as if I were a fascinatingly depressing exhibit at a museum of poverty. "So this is the mother," Robert said, his voice booming and authoritative, lacking any warmth. "David has told us so much about your situation." I forced a weak smile and clutched my battered handbag tighter. "It's nice to meet you," I said softly. "I've heard wonderful things." Catherine tilted her head, her eyes scanning my outfit with clinical precision. "Yes. Well, we certainly have heard about your struggles, Eleanor. It must be so difficult, living on a fixed income in this economy. We were just telling David how admirable it is that he supports you as much as he can, though strictly speaking, one wonders about self-reliance." I felt a sharp stab of anger, hot and sudden, but I swallowed it down. David didn't support me, not by a single cent. In fact, for the last 5 years, I had been secretly funneling money into a trust for his future children, and I had paid off his student loans, all $112,000 of them anonymously, under the guise of a clerical error and a grant program I had invented. He thought he was lucky. He was just loved. But looking at him now, watching him avoid my gaze while his in-laws dissected me, I wondered if that love had been misplaced. I sat on the edge of an armchair, careful not to lean back, maintaining the posture of a guest who knows they are unwelcome. Dinner was announced by a hired caterer, not Isabella cooking, of course, and we moved to the dining room. The table was set with fine bone china and heavy silverware. I noted the vintage, a 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon being poured, decent, retailing around $80 a bottle. Robert took the head of the table, naturally. "So, Eleanor," Robert began, cutting into his steak with aggressive precision. "David tells us you used to work in, what was it, warehousing?" I took a sip of water, my mind flashing to the reality reality. I didn't work in warehousing. I owned the logistics infrastructure that supplied critical surgical equipment to 6 major hospital networks across the tri-state area. I had negotiated contracts with the Department of Defense. I had 45 full-time employees and a fleet of temperature-controlled transport units. But to David, I had simply said I work in shipping back when I started the company in my garage, and as the money grew, I kept the description vague, wanting him to build his own character without the crutch of my wealth. I worked in logistics. Yes, I said quietly. Just administrative work, mostly. Checking boxes. Catherine laughed, a tinkling, condescending sound. Oh, how quaint. It's good to have simple work, isn't it? Less stress. Robert here runs a hedge fund, managing assets over 200 million. The pressure is unimaginable. You're lucky, really, to not have that burden of responsibility. I nodded slowly, staring at my plate. Yes, very lucky. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth, waiting. I knew the turn was coming. The conversation drifted to their recent vacation in Street Barts, their renovations on their summer home in the Hamptons, and Isabella's desire for a new Range Rover. They spoke of money with a vulgar casualness, throwing around numbers 10,000 for a handbag, 50,000 for a club membership, while glancing at me to see if I was suitably impressed or intimidated. I remained silent, eating small bites. Then, halfway through the main course, the atmosphere shifted. Robert cleared his throat, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and looked at David. Well, son, should we discuss the matter at hand? David went pale. He put down his fork and looked at me, his eyes pleading for forgiveness for something he hadn't even done yet. Mom, he started, his voice cracking slightly. We, Isabella and I, and Robert and Catherine, we've been talking. I put my fork down, my heart rate steadying into the cold, rhythmic beat I used during hostile takeovers. Talking about what, David? Isabella jumped in, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, though she wasn't pregnant. About the future, Eleanor. Your future. We're concerned. You're getting older, and frankly, your current living situation is embarrassing. It's an eyesore for us. David is an associate at a top law firm now. It doesn't look good for him to have a mother living in that rundown apartment complex. I lived in a 4-bedroom penthouse in the city center, but I maintained a small rental unit in a working-class neighborhood specifically for their visits, decorated with Goodwill furniture and generic art. They had never seen my real home. I see, I said, keeping my voice level. So, you're worried about my image affecting David's career? Catherine leaned forward, her diamonds clicking against the table edge. It's not just image, dear. It's practicality. We have a proposal. David needs capital. He wants to buy into the partnership early. It's a $200,000 buy-in, and we, the Sterling Vances, have already contributed so much to their wedding and this house. We think it's time you did your part. I blinked, genuinely confused for a moment. But you know, I don't have that kind of money, I said. I live on a pension. Robert smirked, a predatory expression that made my skin crawl. We know you don't have cash, Eleanor, but you have that land. The plot in upstate New York. Your father left it to you, didn't he? My blood ran cold. The land in question was a 300-acre sanctuary I had inherited 30 years ago. It was where my late husband and I had camped. It was pristine forest. It was also, unbeknownst to them, sitting on top of a water table that a bottling company had offered me $12 million for last year, an offer I had rejected because I wanted to preserve the nature. How did they know about the land? I had never discussed the deed with David. He must have gone through my papers during his last visit, rifling through my old filing cabinet while I was making him tea. That land is not for sale, I said, my voice hardening slightly. It's family heritage. David finally spoke, his voice whining. Mom, please, it's just trees. Robert says developers are paying a premium right now. You could sell it, give us the buy-in money, and still have enough left over to move into a nice, assisted living facility. A nice one, not the state-run ones. Isabella nodded vigorously. Exactly. It's a win-win. You get care, and David gets his career. We've actually already had Robert's real estate attorney draft up a power of attorney document. It would just make things easier if you signed it over to David so he can handle the sale for you. You wouldn't have to worry about the taxes or the paperwork. You're not good with complex numbers. Anyway, the audacity was breathtaking. They didn't just want the money. They wanted to liquidate my assets, strip me of my agency, and shuffle me off to a nursing home so I wouldn't be an embarrassment, all while taking a property worth millions for a fraction of its value to fund a law partnership David hadn't earned. I looked at my son. He was 32 years old. I had raised him to be kind, to be honest, and here he was, conspiring with these vultures to defraud his own mother because he thought I was weak. He thought I was stupid. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had failed him. By shielding him from the struggle of building wealth, I had made him weak, and by hiding my success, I had made myself a target. I looked at the document Robert pulled from his jacket pocket. It was a durable power of attorney, granting David full control over my finances and assets. If I signed that, they could legally drain everything I had, not just the land, but if they found my real accounts, they could take it all. They thought they were robbing a beggar, but they were trying to rob a bank vault they didn't know existed. I reached out and took the paper. My hands were steady now. The sorrow was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I read the clauses. Total control, irrevocable, effective immediately. So, let me understand this, I said, looking up at Robert, then Catherine, then Isabella, and finally resting my gaze on David. You invited me here, insulted my clothes, mocked my intelligence, and fed me a steak you probably think is too good for me. all to ambush me into signing over my only asset so you can buy a partnership you're not qualified for? David flushed red. Mom, don't be dramatic. It's for the family. You're not using the land. It's selfish to keep it when I have this opportunity. Selfish. The word hung in the air. I, who had worked 18-hour days for 20 years to ensure he never had a student loan debt he knew about. I, who had paid for his orthodontics, his summer camps, his first car, all while pretending to scrape by so he wouldn't become this. But he had become this anyway. The influence of Isabella and her toxic parents had been like a rot, spreading through the cracks I had left in his character. I looked at the pen Robert was holding out to me. It was a Mont Blanc. I had the same one on my desk at the office, except mine was a limited edition platinum inlay. I took the pen. I held it over the paper. The room was silent, the air thick with their greed. They were practically salivating. I brought the tip of the pen to the paper, and I saw them relax, a collective exhale of triumph. They thought they had won. They thought the old, confused woman was capitulating. I pressed the pen down, not to sign, but to draw a slow, deliberate line through the entire text of the first page. Then I flipped to the second page and did the same. The sound of the pen tearing slightly through the paper was the only noise in the room. Robert's jaw dropped. "What on earth are you doing?" he sputtered. "That's a legal document." I closed the document and tossed it onto the center of the table, right into the bowl of mashed potatoes. "I'm not signing it," I said, my voice dropping the wavering, elderly timbre I had used for years. I shifted my posture, straightening my spine, squaring my shoulders. The transformation was subtle but immediate. I was no longer Eleanor the widow. I was Eleanor the CEO, and I'm not selling the land. Not to you, not to anyone. Isabella gasped. "You crazy old hag! You have no idea what you're doing. You're ruining David's life." Catherine looked at me with pure venom. "This is exactly why the elderly should be wards of the state. She's senile." Robert slammed his hand on the table. "Listen to me, Eleanor. We are trying to help you. You are one unexpected medical bill away from the street. You need us. You need this money. Do you have any idea how much a nursing home costs? Do you have any idea what happens to women like you when the money runs out?" I looked at him, really looked at him, analyzing his suit again. The lapel stitching was machine-made, not hand-rolled, a knockoff or a mid-range designer. His watch was a Rolex Submariner, but the bezel color was slightly off a older model, likely purchased secondhand. These people weren't rich. They were leveraged. They were drowning in debt and projecting an image of wealth, desperate for my land to bail them out. That was the discovery. They weren't just greedy. They were desperate. And desperation makes people sloppy. I stood up. I didn't push the chair back. I simply rose. "I don't need your help, Robert, and I certainly don't need your financial advice." I picked up my thrift store handbag. "I'm leaving. And David," I said, turning to my son, who looked like he was about to be sick, "don't bother walking me out. I know the way." I turned to walk away, but Robert stood up, blocking my path. He was a large man, used to intimidation. "You're not walking out of here until we come to an agreement," he growled, his face reddening. "We have leveraged a lot on this deal going through. You owe your son. You owe us for this dinner. Sit down." He reached out to grab my arm. It was a mistake. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I simply looked at his hand on my cheap coat, then looked up at his eyes with a gaze so flat and terrifyingly calm that he hesitated. "Remove your hand, Robert," I said, "or I will have you arrested for assault. And unlike you, I can afford the kind of lawyers who don't just win cases, they dismantle lives." He blinked, confused by the sudden shift in my diction, the authority in my tone. He let go, stepping back as if burned. I walked to the foyer, the sound of my scuffed shoes on the hardwood echoing. I opened the front door to the rain. Behind me, I heard Isabella screeching, David trying to shush her, and Robert cursing. I stepped out into the night, the cold rain feeling cleansing against my face. I walked the 3 blocks to my Mercedes, disarmed the alarm, and slid into the leather driver's seat. The silence of the cabin was absolute. I started the engine, the dashboard lighting up with a soft digital glow. My phone connected to the car's Bluetooth. I had a missed call from my CFO, Sarah. I ignored it. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, letting the events of the evening process. They wanted a war. They wanted to take everything from the poor, helpless mother. Fine, I put the car into drive. I would give them a war, but it wouldn't be the one they expected. They thought they were fighting a skirmish against a defenseless old woman. They didn't know they had just declared war on a logistical empire. I pulled out of the cul-de-sac, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just be checking boxes. Tomorrow, I would start the investigation. I needed to know exactly how deep their debt went. I needed to know why Robert was so desperate for that buy-in money. I needed to know everything. And once I had the evidence, I would return. Not as the mother they pitied, but as the landlord they couldn't afford. The game had changed, and I held all the cards. The morning after the dinner, I did not go to the small, drafty apartment in the crumbling brick building on 4th Street, where I received my mail and met my son. Instead, I drove directly to the underground parking structure of the Meridian Tower in the financial district, swiping my key card at 5:45 a.m. The security guard, a former Marine named Elias who had been with me for 12 years, nodded sharply as the gate rose. "Good morning, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice echoing in the concrete cavern. I parked in the spot marked CEO and took the private elevator up to the 42nd floor. The silence of the office before the staff arrived was my sanctuary. It was a space of chrome, glass, and efficiency, a stark contrast to the performative poverty I had inhabited the night before. I sat at my desk, a slab of reclaimed walnut walnut that cost more than Robert Sterling Vance's car, and unlocked my terminal. I didn't need coffee. The cold rage simmering in my chest was fuel enough. I picked up the landline and dialed a 4-digit extension. It rang twice before it was answered. "Frank, I need you in my office now." Frank delicately managed what we called corporate risk assessment, which was a polite euphemism for high-level corporate espionage and forensic accounting. He walked in 3 minutes later, holding a tablet, looking like he hadn't slept in a week, which was his natural state. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need a full financial autopsy on 3 individuals," I said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk with the names written in my sharp, angular handwriting. "Robert Sterling Vance, Catherine Sterling Vance, and Isabella Sterling Vance. I also need a deep dive into the employment records of my son, David Calloway, specifically his standing at the firm of Hewitt and Associates." Frank raised an eyebrow, the only sign of surprise he ever showed. "The family?" he asked. I nodded. "The family. I want bank statements, credit scores, mortgage liens, pending lawsuits, and any shell companies. I want to know what they owe, who they owe it to, and how long they have before they drown. And Frank, I want it by noon." He didn't ask why. He simply nodded, tapped his tablet twice, and left the room. I spent the next 4 hours managing the logistics of moving 3 tons of MRI components from a warehouse in Hamburg to a hospital in Chicago, but a part of my brain was entirely focused on the predator I had met the night before. Robert Sterling Vance smelled of desperation. I had seen it in the way he poured the wine too fast, a little shaky. I had seen it in the way Catherine touched her necklace, a nervous tick, checking it was still there. They were hunting for liquidity, and they had mistaken me for prey. At 11:45 a.m., Frank returned. He carried a thick file folder, placing it on my desk with a heavy thud. "It's worse than you thought," he said, sitting down opposite me. I opened the file. The first page was a summary of Robert's hedge fund, Sterling Vance Capital. It wasn't a hedge fund. It was a glorified investment club with 6 clients, all of them elderly, and the returns were fictional. According to the SEC filings Frank had pulled, the fund hadn't made a profit in 48 months. In fact, it was bleeding operational cash at a rate of $55,000 a month. I flipped the page to his personal finances. The house in the suburbs, the one with the impressive foyer and the cream-colored furniture, had 3 mortgages on it. The primary lender was a standard bank, but the second and third liens were held by private equity firms with predatory interest rates hovering around 14%. They were technically underwater on the property by nearly $400,000. I ran my finger down the column of numbers. Credit card debt, $82,000 across 6 cards. Leased vehicles, 2, both 3 months behind on payments. Club memberships, suspended for non-payment as of October 1st. They weren't just broke, they were destitute and living on the fumes of a credit rating that was rapidly collapsing. "And Isabella?" I asked, not looking up. Frank sighed. "She's the worst of them. She has a separate credit line her husband, your son, doesn't know about. $40,000 in debt for clothes, spa treatments, and influencer consulting fees. She's bleeding David dry, and he doesn't even know he's hemorrhaging." I turned to the section on David. This was the part I dreaded. I wanted him to be the victim, the innocent dupe, but the report from Hewitt and Associates painted a grimmer picture. David wasn't up for a partnership buy-in. He was on a performance improvement plan, the corporate equivalent of a final warning. He had missed 3 major filing deadlines in the last quarter. His billable hours were down 20%. The buy-in money they had demanded from me wasn't for a promotion. It was likely to cover a debt or a mistake he had made, or perhaps to simply keep the Sterling Vance ship afloat for another few months while they looked for another victim. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. They weren't just trying to steal my land. They were trying to steal my life to patch the holes in their sinking ship. I closed the file and looked out the window at the gray city skyline. "They think I'm a helpless widow," I said softly. "They think I'm going to sign that power of attorney because I'm scared." Frank leaned forward. "What do you want to do? We can hand this over to the DA. There's enough here for fraud, especially with the investment fund." I shook my head. "No, the DA takes too long, and it's too impersonal. They insulted me in my own son's home. They tried to strip me of my dignity. I want them to feel it. I want them to know exactly who they messed with." I stood up and walked to the wall of monitors, displaying the real-time logistics of my empire. Trucks moving across the Midwest, ships crossing the Atlantic, cargo planes landing in Tokyo. I controlled the flow of essential goods for millions of people. Dealing with a suburban con artist was barely a warm-up. "Get me the contact info for the private equity firm holding their second mortgage," I told Frank, "and find out who actually owns the debt on David's student loans. I want to buy it back from the servicer if I can, or at least become the primary consolidation holder. I want to own their debt, all of it." Frank smiled, a rare, terrifying expression. "Hostile takeover?" he asked. I turned back to him. "Liquidation," I corrected. I spent the next 3 days in a flurry of activity that had nothing to do with medical supplies. I instructed my personal legal team, Sharks, who cost $1,200 an hour, to execute a series of debt acquisitions. Through a shell company named Nemesis Holdings LLC, I purchased the distressed debt of Sterling Vance Capital. It was surprisingly cheap. The original creditors were happy to unload the toxic assets for 60 cents on the dollar. I also contacted the bank holding the lien on David's house. It turned out David had co-signed a loan for Robert 6 months ago, using his own home as collateral. My son, the lawyer, had violated every rule of basic financial preservation because he was so desperate to please these people. By Friday afternoon, I effectively owned Robert Sterling Vance. I owned his house, I owned his car leases, and I owned the debt of his failing company. And he had no idea. He thought Nemesis Holdings was just another faceless corporate entity. But I wasn't done collecting evidence. I needed the final nail in the coffin. I needed them to admit it. I needed to hear them say, out loud, that they viewed me as nothing more than a resource to be consumed. I unlocked my burner phone, the cheap Android I used for my Eleanor the Widow persona, and saw 14 missed calls from David and 6 text messages from Isabella. The texts ranged from faux concerned, Eleanor, we're so worried about your mental state, to aggressive, you need to sign the papers, David is crying because of you. I typed a reply to David, I am sorry about the other night. I was confused. Please, can we meet again? I want to make things right. I will bring the deed to the land. Come to my apartment on Sunday at 1 p.m. It was the bait, and they took it instantly. We'll be there, David replied within seconds. Robert and Catherine will come too to help explain the legal parts. Of course they would. They wouldn't trust David to close the deal. Sunday arrived with a sky the color of bruised iron. I went to the apartment early to stage the scene. I scattered unpaid bills, fake ones I had printed across the kitchen table. I turned the thermostat down to 60 degrees so it would feel cold and impoverished. I put on the same threadbare coat, but this time I had a team. In the unmarked van parked across the street sat Frank and a videographer, monitoring the hidden cameras and microphones I had installed in the living room and kitchen. Every word, every sneer, every threat would be recorded in 4K resolution. At 1 p.m. sharp, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find the entire clan. Robert, Catherine, Isabella, and David. They looked impatient. They pushed past me into the small living room, wrinkling their noses at the smell of old paper and dust I had synthesized. Robert didn't waste time on pleasantries this time. He didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the room, filling the space with his bulk. Do you have the deed? He demanded. I stood by the kitchen counter, my hands shaking, acting. I have it, I stammered, but I have questions. Why do you need it so urgently? Is David in trouble? Catherine scoffed, brushing a piece of invisible lint from her coat. It's not about trouble, Eleanor. It's about optimization. We told you. David is ascending. We are simply positioning assets. Now, give us the paper. I looked at David. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at a water stain on the ceiling. David, I said, my voice pleading. Is this what you want? To take your mother's land? He flinched, but didn't look at me. It's for the best, Mom. You can't manage it. Robert knows what to do. Isabella stepped forward, snapping her gum. God, just give it to him. Stop being so dramatic. We have a brunch reservation at 2:30. You're literally wasting our time. I pulled the deed, a photocopy, naturally out of my bag, along with the power of attorney document they had tried to make me sign. Robert's eyes lit up with a greed so naked it was almost pornographic. He reached for it, but I pulled it back. One more thing, I said, my voice shifting slightly, becoming a fraction steadier. If I sign this, will you promise to take care of me? Will you make sure I'm not alone? Robert laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. We'll make sure you're exactly where you belong, Eleanor. Don't worry. We have a place picked out, very secure, very quiet, which was code for a state-funded dumping ground. I knew the facility they were hinting at. It had a 2-star rating and a history of neglect violations. That was the confession. They didn't care if I lived or died as long as the check cleared. I let out a long, slow breath. The acting was over. I placed the papers on the table, but I didn't pick up the pen. Instead, I looked directly at the hidden camera and the smoke detector, then turned my gaze to Robert. I think, I said, dropping the waver in my voice completely and speaking with the crisp, icy diction of a woman who commands boardrooms, that we have a misunderstanding of the term assets. The room went quiet. The change in my demeanor was so abrupt, it was like the air pressure had dropped. Robert frowned. What did you say? I straightened up, shedding the slump of the old woman. I smoothed my coat, which suddenly didn't look like a costume anymore, but like a disguise being discarded. I said, we have a misunderstanding. You see, Robert, you believe you are here to acquire an asset to cover your $3.4 million in accumulative debt. You believe that by liquidating my 300 acres, you can pay off the 14% interest loan you took out from Onyx Private Equity to cover the losses of your fraudulent hedge fund. Robert's face went slack. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Catherine grasped his arm, her knuckles white. How? How do you know about Onyx? I continued, taking a step toward them. I wasn't retreating anymore. I was advancing. And you, Isabella, you believe that this money will cover the $42,000 you owe on your American Express black card, avoiding the discovery of your spending addiction by your husband. Isabella let out a small squeak of terror. And David, I said, turning to my son, you think this will save you from the performance improvement plan at Hewitt and Associates. You think money will buy you the competence you haven't displayed in the last 2 years. But here is the reality. I picked up the stack of fake bills on the table and dropped them into the trash can. I don't need you to take care of me. I have never needed you to take care of me. In fact, for the last decade, I have been the invisible hand keeping your entire precarious lives from shattering. Robert found his voice. Who are you? He whispered. It wasn't a question of identity, but of magnitude. He realized suddenly that the woman in front of him was not small. I am the CEO of Callaway Logistics, I said, the words ringing in the small apartment. My net worth is in the mid-8 figures. I don't just own land, Robert. As of yesterday afternoon, I own the shell company that holds the deed to your house. I own the debt on your cars, and I own the promissory notes for your business. I am not your victim. I am your creditor. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of shock. Then, my phone buzzed. It was Frank. Police are 2 minutes out. Fraud unit. I smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach my eyes. And unlike the bank, I said, checking my watch, a Patek Philippe I had pulled from my pocket and strapped onto my wrist in front of their widening eyes. I don't offer grace periods. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, getting louder with every second. David looked at me, his face crumbling into a mask of horror and realization. Mom, he croaked. I looked at him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see his mother. He saw the titan he had underestimated. Sit down, David, I commanded. We're going to have a meeting. The siren stopped right outside the building. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was an eviction from their own reality. The heavy wooden door of the apartment, which I had deliberately left unlocked, swung open with a force that rattled the cheap frame. It wasn't a chaotic raid, but a precise procedural entry executed by 4 officers in plain clothes, wearing tactical vests emblazoned with NYPD major crimeses. Leading them was Detective Miller, a man I had spoken with on the phone 3 times in the last 24 hours, a man who had been building a case against the Sterling Vance fraudulent investment circle for 6 months, but had lacked the internal financial leverage to execute a warrant until my forensic accountant, Frank, had handed him the smoking gun on a silver platter earlier that morning. Robert stood frozen, his face draining of color until it resembled the grayish paste of the unpainted walls. Catherine let out a shrill, bird-like cry and clutched her husband's arm. Isabella simply backed away, knocking over a lamp, her eyes darting between the police and me, realizing too late that the dynamic of power in the room had inverted so completely that gravity itself felt different. Robert Sterling Vance, Detective Miller said, his voice flat and bored, the tone of a man who had said these words 1,000 times. I have a warrant for your arrest on 12 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of securities fraud, and 1 count of money laundering. Please place your hands behind your back. Robert stammered, his bluster evaporating. This is a mistake. My attorney, I am a respected member of the community. You can't just barge in here. Miller didn't argue. He simply nodded to the 2 officers behind him, who moved forward with the synchronized efficiency of machinery. The metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest sound in the universe. Catherine began to sob, a theatrical heaving display. You can't take him. He has a heart condition. This is her fault. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at me. She set us up. She's a witch. I remained motionless, leaning against the kitchen counter, my arms crossed over the chest of my thrift store coat. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply watched, cataloging the moment with the same detached scrutiny I used when inspecting a warehouse for safety violations. Isabella tried to slip toward the door, muttering something about needing to call a lawyer, but a female officer stepped in her path. Isabella Sterling Vance? The officer asked. We have a warrant for your arrest as well. Accessory to fraud and solicitation of funds under false pretenses. Isabella screamed. It was a raw, ugly sound. No, I didn't do anything. It was him. She pointed at her father. He made me sign the papers. I just wanted the car. I looked at David. He was the only one not being cuffed. He stood in the center of the room, an island of collapse in a sea of ruin. He looked at his wife, who was selling out her own father to save her skin. He looked at his father-in-law, the man he had idolized, who was currently being read his Miranda rights while trying to bribe the detective with a watch that I knew was a fake. And then he looked at me. Mom, he whispered, his voice trembling with the regression of a terrified child. What is happening? I walked over to him, stepping over the fallen lamp. The police gave me a wide berth. They knew who I was. They knew that Eleanor the widow was a fiction, and that Eleanor Calloway, the taxpayer who contributed heavily to the police benevolent fund, was the architect of this takedown. David, I said, my voice quiet but piercing through the chaos. What is happening is the inevitable result of living a lie. You wanted to be part of their world. This is their world. It is built on theft and deceit. And because you signed your name next to theirs on those loan documents, because you let them leverage your credit and your reputation, you are now part of the wreckage. He grabbed my hand. Mom, you have to help me, you said. You said you had money. You said you were the CEO. You can fix this. You can pay the bail. You can hire the lawyers. Please. They'll disbar me. I'll lose everything. I looked down at his hand gripping mine. It was the hand of a man who had never faced a consequence I hadn't shielded him from. I thought about the check I wrote for his student loans. I thought about the trust fund I had been building for his children, the one I had dissolved 24 hours ago. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm. I am not going to bail you out, David, I said. The words hit him harder than a physical blow. He recoiled, his eyes widening. What? But you're my mother. Precisely, I replied. I am your mother, and for 32 years I have failed you by protecting you from the reality of the world. I let you believe that appearances mattered more than substance. I let you marry into a family of vipers because I didn't want to be the overbearing parent. I paid your way and let you think it was luck. No more. I stepped back. I have purchased the debt you owe, David. Nemesis Holdings LLC is me. This means I am your primary creditor. You owe me $215,000 for the co-signed loans on Robert's house. You will pay me back, every cent, with interest. He stared at me, his mouth agape. You're going to sue me? I'm going to enforce the contract, I corrected. You are a lawyer. You understand contracts. Welcome to the real world. The police escorted Robert, Catherine, and Isabella out of the apartment. As Robert passed me, he spat on the floor near my feet. "You'll rot in hell, you bitter old hag," he hissed. I didn't even blink. "I'll see you at the deposition, Robert," I said calmly. And then they were gone. The room was suddenly quiet, save for the sound of the rain against the window and David's ragged breathing. He sank onto the cheap, stained sofa, burying his head in his hands. I didn't sit with him. I picked up my bag, checked my phone to ensure Frank had secured the perimeter, and walked to the door. "You know where to find me, David," I said. "My office is in the Meridian Tower. Make an appointment with my secretary." I walked out into the rain, leaving my son alone in the cold, fake apartment to contemplate the very real ruins of his life. The aftermath was not quick. It was a slow, grinding procedural machinery that lasted for 18 months. The legal system, when fueled by the kind of capital I possessed, is a terrifyingly efficient beast. I didn't have to do much personally. My legal team, led by a shark named Harrison, who charged $1,500 an hour, dismantled the Sterling Vance existence brick by brick. The trial of Robert Sterling Vance was a spectacle. The local press, fed tips by my public relations team, branded him the suburban Madoff. The evidence I had provided the forensic accounting of his hedge fund was irrefutable. He had defrauded retirees of over $4 million. He was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. I attended the sentencing. I sat in the back row, wearing a tailored Armani suit, my face impassive. When the judge read the sentence, Robert turned and looked at me. There was no defiance left in his eyes, only a hollow, crushing defeat. Catherine avoided prison time by pleading ignorance and turning state's witness against her husband, but her punishment was perhaps more severe for a woman of her vanity. Total social excommunication. Nemesis Holdings foreclosed on their house. I didn't sell it immediately. I let it sit empty for 6 months, the lawn growing wild, the paint peeling, a monument to their failure in the middle of their pristine neighborhood. When I finally sold it, I did so at a loss to a developer who bulldozed the architectural masterpiece to build 4 modest starter homes. Catherine moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighboring town, working as a receptionist at a dental clinic. I saw her once, months later, waiting for a bus. She looked old. She looked tired. She didn't see me in the back of my town car. Isabella's fate was tied to the debts she had tried to hide. David divorced her 3 months after the arrest. It wasn't amicable. She tried to go after his assets, only to find he had none because I held the lien on everything. She ended up declaring Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The last I heard, she was trying to launch a lifestyle coaching business on Instagram, but the comments section was permanently disabled due to the flood of messages from her father's victims. And then there was David. The lesson I taught him was the hardest thing I have ever done. For the first 6 months, he hated me. He sent angry emails, left drunken voicemails, accused me of being a sociopath. He lost his job at Hewitt and Associates. The firm didn't want the bad publicity of an associate involved in a fraud scandal, even tangentially. He was investigated by the Bar Association. He came within an inch of losing his license, surviving only because he could prove he was a victim of coercion and had not actively participated in the solicitation of funds. But his career in high-stakes corporate law was over. He was radioactive. He had to move out of his house. I foreclosed on that too. I didn't kick him out on the street. I am not a monster, but I made him sign a lease for the apartment on 4th Street, the same crappy apartment where he had once looked down on me. I charged him market rent. I made him pay his own utilities. For a year, he worked as a paralegal for a public defender, making $45,000 a year. He took the bus. He learned how to budget for groceries. He learned what it felt like to have the heat turned off because the check was late. I watched him from a distance. I didn't call. I didn't visit. I waited. It was 2 years and 3 months after the dinner when he finally came to my office. He didn't have an appointment, but Elias, the security guard, let him up. I was reviewing the quarterly logistics reports for the Asian sector when the door opened. David stood there. He looked different. He had lost the soft, doughy look of the country club. He was thinner. His hair was cut simply, and he was wearing a suit that was clearly off the rack, but pressed immaculately. He didn't look like a boy pretending to be a man anymore. He looked like a man who had walked through fire. "Hi, Mom," he said. I put down my pen. "Hello, David." He walked over to the chair opposite my desk, the same chair Frank had sat in when we planned the destruction of his in-laws, and sat down. He didn't slouch. He looked me in the eye. "I brought you a check," he said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "It's not much. $500. It's the first installment for the loan interest." I picked up the envelope. I didn't open it. I just held it. "Okay," I said. He took a deep breath. I also wanted to say, "Thank you." I raised an eyebrow. "Thank you? For ruining your life?" He shook his head. "You didn't ruin my life. You saved it." "I was drowning, Mom. I was drowning in their expectations, in the debt, in the lies. I was becoming one of them. I hated myself every day. When you took everything away, it forced me to find out who I actually was." I paused, the silence stretching between us, heavy and significant. "And who are you, David?" He smiled, a small, genuine smile I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. "I'm a public defender. I represent people who don't have anyone else. People who are actually poor, not just pretending. And I'm good at it. I'm really good at it. I feel useful." I looked at my son. The weak, whining sycophant was gone. In his place was a man with integrity. The rot had been cut out and the healthy tissue had healed. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a file. It contained the promissory note for the $200,000. I placed it on the desk next to his check. "I am proud of you, David," I said. The words caught in my throat, thick with emotion I usually suppress. impressed. I picked up my platinum Mont Blanc pen, the same one I had refused to sign the power of attorney with. I drew a line through the debt. Consider this paid in full. David stared at the paper. Mom, you don't have to. I know, I interrupted. That's why it matters. You earned this. You paid the price. The debt is cleared. Come here. He stood up and walked around the desk. We hugged, and for the first time in years, it wasn't a stiff, obligatory embrace. It was solid. It was real. 5 years have passed since that night. I am retired now. I stepped down as CEO last year, handing the reins over to Sarah, my CFO, though I remain the chairman of the board. I spend most of my time at the cabin, on the 300 acres of land in upstate New York, the land they tried to steal. It is autumn now. The trees are a riot of gold and crimson. The air is crisp and smells of pine and wood smoke. I sit on the porch in a rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket that is genuinely old, not a prop. My phone is inside, turned off. I don't check the stock market every hour. I don't manage supply chains. I watch the leaves fall. David is coming up this weekend with his new fiancée, a school teacher named Elena, who has kind eyes and doesn't care about brand names. They are going to help me winterize the garden. I take a sip of tea and look out over the forest. The silence here is different from the silence of the office or the silence of the empty penthouse. It is the silence of resolution. I think about Robert sometimes, sitting in his cell. I think about the anger that drove me, the cold, metallic fury that fueled the destruction of the Sterling Vances. It is gone now. I don't feel vindicated anymore. I just feel peaceful. Justice is a heavy hammer, and I swung it with precision, but I have put it down. The woods are quiet. The wind rustles the dry leaves. I close my eyes and listen to the sound of my own breathing, steady and calm, the rhythm of a life that is finally, truly my own.